The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Well, hello there. Thank you so much for joining me for episode 81 of Things Are About to Get Weird. I hope you're all well and feeling ready for a little trip over to the paranormal side of town today. Quite literally, in fact, as the story I have for you takes place in the Somerset market town of Shepton Mallet. When I received a message from one of our listeners, Simon, asking whether I'd heard about some of the haunted happenings at the town's former prison, I was instantly intrigued, and the more I read, the more captivated I became by this strange and fascinating place. Before we start, a few quick warnings that there will be brief mentions of executions in this episode, as well as a story involving someone taking their own life, and another which references the deaths of young children. So please do be aware of all of that before you decide to listen today. So, is the old Shepton Mallet prison really the most haunted of its kind? Let's find out together. Allow me to set the scene for you. Over 400 years ago, in 1624, it was decided that the town of Shepton Mallet was the ideal location for a new House of Corrections that would help to serve the eastern side of the county of Somerset. Just the next year, in 1625, the prison, which is also known as Cornhill, was opened under the governance of a man named George Sheephay, and to say that it was a somewhat primitive operation is possibly the understatement of the 17th century. Not only was the sanitation situation fairly dire, leading to outbreaks of all kinds of diseases amongst the inmates and probably the jailers too, but the housing and categorization of the prisoners was also not ideal either. It was common for men, women and children to be grouped together in the jail, and there was little to no consideration for the seriousness of an inmate's crimes either. So it was highly possible for a child who was found to have become entangled in some kind of petty theft to be housed with men convicted of murder. This sounds awful enough, but when you add in the fact that the staff were poorly paid and often unmotivated to enforce the rules, it was a recipe for complete disaster. I can't even begin to imagine some of the awful incidents that must have taken place there, all of these factors considered. By the 1800s, following a fairly wild period in the British judicial system, which involved everything from what was known as the Bloody Code, a system which meant that over 200 different offences now carried the death penalty, including crimes like, quote, stealing from a rabbit warren, not to mention the practice of forcibly transporting some prisoners to places like Australia, it was decided that the entire system needed to be reformed, and this included prisons. Shepton Mallet was expanded during this time period, and part of this expansion included the building of aspects like a treadwheel house in 1823. This served two purposes. It formed part of the prison's hard labour punishment programme, as inmates were made to walk on these steps in order to turn the wheel, which then also powered a mill that was built near to the prison. Now, in 1868, public executions were actually abolished, which meant that they now had to take place behind prison walls. We know that between 1889 and 1926, 7 men who had been convicted of murder were executed at Shepton Mallet, and we also know that their remains were buried within the prison grounds. Moving into the 20th century, the population of the prison began to decline further and further, and by 1930 there were just 50 male inmates left serving their time there. Due to the small population numbers and the fact the building was in a pretty rough state, the decision was taken to close it down, but the doors did not stay sealed for long. A new chapter in the jail's Bristol's dark history was about to begin when it became a military prison at the start of World War II. Initially, it was a British military prison, but was then taken over by the US military. Between 1942 and 1945, over 700 US servicemen were locked up in Shepton Mallet, with 18 of them eventually being executed. Some very disturbing stories about this period of time have emerged in more recent years. For example, a soldier and former Shepton Mallet military prisoner named Bernard Benedict James revealed that he was sent to the institution for around a year, along with 17 other soldiers, all of whom were black, simply for standing up for a friend of theirs against a white commanding officer. I'll be leaving a link in the show notes to an article which goes over Bernard's story in much more detail. I would definitely recommend doing some further reading about what he went through. Now, during this wartime period, the old women's wing of the prison was used for the storage of some incredibly important documents that had been moved there temporarily from London, including a copy of the Magna Carta and the Doomsday Book. After the war, Shepton Mallet switched back to being a British military prison, and at this time briefly housed arguably two of the most infamous inmates in our nation's history, the Cray twins, Ronnie and Reggie Cray. In 1966, the prison once again became a civilian institution, and in 2001 it became a specialist prison for housing men convicted of the most serious crimes, who all had life sentences but were considered to be lower risk due to the amount of time they'd already served. And finally, in 2013, the prison was closed down and decommissioned, until which point it had been considered the oldest functioning prison in Britain and one of the oldest in the entire world. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the general history of the prison, just to give you some vital context, which is especially important when it comes to talking about Shepton Mallet's haunted reputation. Are you ready to hear some of the most eerie and at times incredibly strange ghostly tales reported by those who've spent time at the prison? Let's begin with a paranormal encounter that I found particularly bizarre, the story told by former tour guide Paul Toole. Now, after Shepton Mallet closed in 2013, the site actually became a tourist attraction, and to this day it offers everything from kids' activities and history tours to evening events for adults and a whole host of ghostly offerings too. Paul was one of the guides working at the location in the autumn of 2017, and as part of the tour he offered, he would lead groups around various key spots within the site, whilst explaining the historical significance of each part. One evening, Paul was leading a group of visitors into the old execution room, and as he did so, he told them the story of Private Lee Davis, an American soldier who had been sentenced to death at Shepton Mallet. Private Davis had been convicted of multiple offences, including the murder of a young woman in Wiltshire, and was executed on the 14th of December 1943. It's said that just before his sentence was carried out, the reality that he was about to die struck Davis, and he became hysterical, trying to struggle against the fate he was about to meet. Now, as Paul was telling the tour group about Davis's execution, something very odd happened to him. In his own words, quote, "I had a real searing pain in my left hand and thought, that's painful. I carried on with the tour, and it wasn't until I left outside in the corridor I looked down at my hand and saw a massive scar. It was almost like a cigarette had been put out with my hand. It was bleeding quite badly. That scar stayed with me for about 2 years before it finally healed up. I have seen a photo of this cigarette-like burn on Paul's hand, and I have to be honest, that's exactly what it looks like, a cigarette burn. And it gets weirder because, by all accounts, Private Davis had been a renowned chain smoker. I'm sure that the more skeptical amongst us would point out that smoking cigarettes, especially in the armed forces, was incredibly common back then. And of course, I accept this. But the wound Paul was left with after this incident was so specific and looked so deep and sore that I can't imagine it would have happened to him without him realizing it. It truly doesn't look like he just caught his hand on something sharp or banged it on something. And it definitely doesn't seem like the kind of injury you just wouldn't notice for a while. It looks like a painful, cigarette-sized burn. Very, very strange. The next story I have for you may be more along the classic ghost storylines, but I guarantee that it's no less creepy. I've mentioned the phenomenon of white lady ghosts a few times on the podcast, and as you'll know if you've listened to episode 10, where I share details about my own paranormal encounters, I actually saw a white lady ghost with my own eyes as a child. Whether you believe in these spirits or not is totally up to you. I know what I saw, but I also understand that it's much trickier for someone who hasn't had that kind of experience to fully embrace the concept. However, when it comes to the White Lady of Shepton Mallet prison, it's quite fascinating to note just how deep the story goes. For decades, if not longer, prisoners and prison officers alike have reported seeing a figure dressed in white standing on various staircases or gliding through corridors, largely in the former C wing. And as the story goes, during the 1970s, these odd happenings became so frequent that the situation was escalated to the Home Office. Prisoners began requesting extra bedding, complaining that sudden cold drafts would sweep past their cells at random, always accompanied by the unexplained smell of sweet perfume. The sightings of the White Lady were also starting to put some prisoners visibly on edge, and even some hardened officers were actually refusing to work the night shift because they were genuinely so creeped out by the feeling of her presence. As a result of these bizarre complaints, the Home Office actually carried out a 3-day-long investigation into the claims, and although their findings were inconclusive, those within the prison were sure of what they'd encountered. But who was the White Lady? Well, we do have a leading theory on this one. The prison themselves have claimed that after doing some research into her possible identity, they discovered that, quote, she had murdered her husband and was brought to Shepton Mallet prison for her final days before being hanged in the town centre. The night before her execution, she was offered her final request. She asked to wear her wedding dress. The morning of her execution, the door to her cell swung open, and to the surprise of the officers, her lifeless body laid on the bed, dressed in the wedding dress. The officers silently checked her body for a reason behind her death. No marks were found, and it was concluded that she must have died of a broken heart. As someone who has spent an enormous amount of time looking into different ghost stories over the years, this kind of tale does fit with what we often hear about these White Lady spirits. There's usually some kind of tragic element within them, often that the lady's death took place either shortly before or shortly after her wedding, and it's common for a theme of heartbreak to run through the story too. As a believer in ghosts, I would say that this sounds plausible to me, but I feel like I can already hear the skeptic saying that it sounds like something from a film script. Obviously, in this case, there's that added element of her being in prison because that she had murdered her husband, which definitely makes her request to wear her wedding dress feel extra creepy. Clearly, judging by how freaked out both the prison guards and the inmates reported feeling by her presence, it's possible that she's quite a malevolent spirit. Alternatively though, some reports about the White Lady suggest that she was actually falsely convicted, which could definitely explain why her spirit is so restless. Whatever the truth may be, one thing that's certain amongst believers in Shepton Mallet's haunted status is that the White Lady is not the only spirit still residing there. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the prison's history of housing and executing so many soldiers, the ghosts of at least 2 servicemen in uniform have been sighted there over the years. According to Bristol Live, before the prison was decommissioned, there were numerous rounds of renovation works carried out at the site, and one part that was modernised was the kitchen area. Interestingly, the former tour guide, Paul Toole, cites this as the space he hated being in, telling the publication that if it was somewhere it looked like he would have to lock up at night, he would rota on another member of staff so he could avoid being there. And it seems he's not alone in his unease. During one of the renovation projects, workers at the site reported seeing the spirit of a man dressed in military uniform glide straight through one of the walls and move down a corridor before disappearing. After this encounter, the workers were so terrified by what they'd seen that they refused to continue the jobs they were doing at the site. And although another investigation was carried out into what had happened, once again, it produced no answers. Staff at the prison believed that what the workers may have seen was the ghost of one of the US Army's firing squad members, who was actually killed himself during an execution when a bullet ricocheted off a wall and struck him. The kitchens are not the only area within the prison that are thought to be especially haunted though. The grounds around the prison buildings, including the exercise yard, are also said to be home to a fair few restless spirits, including that of Captain Philip William Ryle. He was a former army surgeon who had been accused of attempted murder and was being held at Shepton Mallet whilst he awaited his trial, which was due to take place in November of 1917. According to an account I found by historian Dave J. Cable, it was clear to all involved that the captain was struggling with something that was affecting his behaviour, which had likely been the reason for him lashing out at the man he was accused of trying to kill, a doctor who he had been under the care of for a number of years. On the 27th of September 1917, before his trial could ever take place, the captain was out in the exercise yard when he took the opportunity to climb up an unattended ladder which led to a high rooftop. After reaching the top, despite being encouraged to return back down safely, he tragically jumped from the roof, which left him with very serious injuries. He sadly passed away early the next morning, and during his autopsy, it was revealed that he had multiple poorly treated injuries that must have been from prior accidents, including an old break in one of his leg bones. His brother then confirmed that he had fallen from a horse during a training exercise some years earlier, and it said that his demeanour had drastically changed after the incident, implying that he may have been living with some kind of brain injury that had significantly altered his behaviour, and it seems this could have contributed to the awful situation which caused his life to end. It said that his final words before he jumped were, quote, "Get back," something I assume he was shouting to those trying to talk him away from the edge. And it's these very words that many have reported hearing echo around the exercise yard over a century later. And interestingly, this is an occurrence that was most frequently reported by inmates at the prison, rather than ghost hunt visitors, for example. Given how unsettled the captain was towards the end of his life, it's perhaps not too much much of a stretch to deduce that his spirit may have still been present in the place where he passed, but my fellow believers may be comforted to know that a recent event may have changed this. The historian I just mentioned, Dave J. Cable, actually did something quite amazing for the 105th anniversary of the captain's tragic death, arranging for a plaque to be placed in the exercise yard to honour his memory. There was a ceremony held to unveil the tribute, and 3 generations of Captain Ryle's family were actually in attendance, which was honestly incredible to hear about. This happened in 2022, and I haven't been able to find any accounts after this date speaking about these phantom calls ringing out in the yard, so I really do hope that the captain's spirit has been able to find some peace. However, it's thought that there are some other souls still roaming within the walls of Shepton Mallet who many would argue deserve no peace at all. And it's here we arrive at the tale of another of the prison's most infamous former inmates, Amelia Dyer, otherwise known as the Bristol baby farmer, one of the most prolific serial killers of the Victorian era. This story is genuinely horrible, so do feel free to skip ahead a minute or two if you'd prefer, because Dyer's crimes were nothing short of atrocious. She made a living for herself in the most heinous way imaginable, by posing as a kind of unofficial adoption service to vulnerable pregnant women. She would offer to take their newborns from them for a fee, promising the mothers that their baby would grow up in a safe home, and once she had their money, she would end the poor child's life without a second thought. It's estimated that she murdered hundreds of infants before finally being executed for her crimes in 1896. But one of the many reasons her story is so frustrating is because she'd been arrested and imprisoned almost 20 years earlier in 1879 after being convicted of gross negligence following investigations into the deaths of 2 children who had been in her care. She was sentenced to just 6 months hard labour at none other than Shepton Mallet Prison. By all accounts, her time spent in the institution was designed to be truly awful. On top of the endless hours of manual labour, she was forced to spend most of her days in complete silence, and was referred to by her inmate number rather than her name. Once her sentence was complete and she was released, it seemed at first as though she was reformed and a quote, changed woman, but as I've alluded to, this did not last, and Dyer went on to commit an unthinkable number of murders of young children after her time at Shepton Mallet. Now, although Dyer wasn't executed at the prison, and her ghost is said to haunt other locations including the corridors of the Old Bailey in London, some claim they've encountered some very strange moments they believe are linked to Dyer during various Shepton Mallet ghost tours. I have spent a lot of time reading reviews and comments from those who have attended these events at the prison over the past few years, and a surprising number of them reference Amelia Dyer. For example, on the 13th of December 2024, a user called Shazbug1970 posted a photo on TripAdvisor along with a written review of their visit to the prison. The image looks to have been taken through a set of bars, looking into a cell that has been staged to illustrate the fact that Dyer was once housed there. I personally find the setup to be the bad kind of weird, but the photo shows a mannequin of a lady meant to be Dyer sitting in a chair holding a mannequin of a baby. Very grim. But anyway, when you first look at the photo, there's a kind of white shadow hovering above the dummy figures. And initially, I didn't think it was all that odd, but after I tilted my head, I could make out that this shape resembled that of a woman sitting holding a baby. I'll be sure to provide a link to the full TripAdvisor review in the show notes or description box. So feel free to check it out for yourself and let me know what you can see. Maybe it was a little bit of a stretch, but I definitely found it a bit strange. Another online post, this time by the paranormal investigation group The Haunted Exchange, described how one of their members started doodling the image of a woman whilst on one of the nighttime tours, only for it to be revealed that they were near to Amelia Dyer's cell, then realizing that they had essentially drawn someone who looked exactly like the infamous killer, despite having no previous knowledge of her appearance. Whilst I couldn't find any accounts of people actually seeing Dyer's spirit wandering about in the same way that perhaps the White Lady ghost does, it's clear that several people feel there's some remnants of her energy left in the prison where she spent months of her life. Whether you're a believer in the paranormal or not, I'm sure that we can all relate to that feeling that something isn't quite right. It might feel like there's someone or something in a room with you when you're the only one there, or that you're being watched when you know no one is looking at you, at least not that you can see. I personally think that a place can feel extremely haunted even if you don't necessarily see a presence with your own eyes. I've experienced this more times than I can count in all kinds of places, and from all of the accounts I've read, this seems to be what so many have reported feeling at Shepton Mallet. On that note, I wanted to share another detail with you from that brilliant Bristol Live article I mentioned earlier, written by Sophie Prideaux. In the piece, Sophie mentions a bizarre incident that happened to her during her visit to the prison, specifically in the C Wing, which is thought to be one of the most active areas in terms of ghostly activity. This is really odd. So, in her own words, quote, "As I took my phone out to start filming, my camera completely froze. No matter how many times I closed the app and reopened, it would not move from the same frozen screen. No problem, I thought, we'll use our other phone. So I started to record a video, the video you see at the top of this article. It was all going fine until it stopped recording on its own, just as I was about to enter a second cell. I thought maybe the phone's memory was full, but was assured it wasn't. So tried again. The phone's entire screen went white. And no matter how many times we tried to re-record video, it just wouldn't work. A coincidence? Maybe with one phone, but two perfectly functioning iPhones not working at the same time? That's odd." I completely agree. There's something about the malfunction of everyday items in locations that are thought to be haunted that I find very creepy. If you have checked out episode 10 of the podcast, you'll know that one of my own paranormal experiences involved a mobile phone. So when I read this account, it sent a little shiver down my spine, I must admit. I spotted that Shepton Mallet actually offers an overnight experience where you spend 12 hours from 8 p.m. until 8 a.m. locked up behind bars, with the guides walking you through key locations within the prison. And whilst I have done an overnight ghost hunt at a castle in the past, there's something about the idea of it being in a prison that's way spookier to me, especially a prison with a reputation like this one. But that's not to say that Shepton Mallet is the only former penitentiary in the UK known for its haunted happenings. Others which could give it a run for its money when it comes to the title of most haunted include places like Shrewsbury Prison. Their most famous spirits include the Grey Lady, who, like Shepton Mallet's White Lady, is thought to haunt their C Wing area, as well as a figure that has the most ominous of names, the Shadow Man, said to lurk in the dark corridors corridors or in the corner of cells, and is alleged to cast a feeling of pure dread over those who find themselves in his presence. Visitors to Shrewsbury Prison often report hearing sounds of someone faintly crying in the distance, giggles which sound like they belong to children, and feeling firm yet gentle touches on their shoulders when no one is around them. Objects are said to move on their own, with doors slamming shut and opening of their own accord, whilst paranormal investigators using thermal cameras have claimed to capture the figure of a person who does not emit any body heat. Oof, I feel like I'm not emitting any body heat. That just made my blood run cold for a moment there. But why is it that places like prisons are said to have so many otherworldly tales linked to them? Well, a leading theory is that places associated with trauma, death, and suffering are somehow imprinted by all of this heavy energy. Perhaps some of the souls who perish there have unfinished business, or are looking to right a perceived wrong, or just wish to cause others still in the land of the living some of the same fear or discomfort that they experienced in their final days. Alternatively, the skeptics would likely argue that if someone were to enter a building like a very old prison, somewhere they've been told is haunted, they're going to be more on edge, almost looking for something to make them jump or to fulfill their expectation regarding ghostly presences. I actually do see both sides, but as both a believer and someone who has been inside an old prison I very much think is haunted, which is Alcatraz, I am so intrigued to see how I'd feel inside Shepton Mallet. Could this really be the UK's most haunted prison? It seems there's only one way for me to find out what I think for sure. I reckon a visit to Somerset may very well be on the cards for me, and whilst the prospect is exciting, I have to admit that I'm already just a little bit scared. Well, this was one of those episodes where I feel that some kind of update may be on the horizon in the future. I promise that once I do make it down to Shepton Mallet, I will be sure to fill you in on my experiences there. Had you heard about the hauntings at this former institution before? Would you be brave enough to take one of the ghost tours, especially the overnight one? I think that will have to be the subject of this episode's poll. So if you're listening within the first month on Spotify, do be sure to check that out and cast your vote. And as always, please do leave me a comment and share your views on this one. I absolutely love to read your notes about all of our episodes. It's one of the most fun parts about doing the show for me. But before we get chatting, there's still time for our outro feature. So let's head on over to Weird Media. Okay, today's recommendation is actually more of a tip-off than a specific shout-out. But if you're a fan of beautiful books, and specifically beautiful book covers, then this one is for you. Now, in general, I have to say that I'm a big fan of independent bookshops and second-hand bookshops, and I will always support those first and foremost. But every now and again, I'll make an exception if I spot something special elsewhere, and that's actually what's happened to me twice now during the past couple of months at TK Maxx. I've discovered that they're stocking a few of these gorgeous complete works editions by authors I've mentioned over and over again on the podcast. And I've added two absolute gems to my bookshelf lately. The first was this, the complete tales and poems of Edgar Allan Poe. And if you're listening rather than watching today, it has the most dreamy lilac cover with a black raven on the front, with a gold finish on the edges of the pages. And although I removed the price sticker, from memory, this was no more than £10, which is an absolute bargain. I have loved flicking through this, and I was even able to use it for reference a couple of episodes ago too, when I mentioned his short story William Wilson. So that was the first one I found, and the second was just a few days back. and it's the complete novels of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This cover is even more stunning in a way. It's black with gold and metallic red accents. And this one was just $7.99, which made me audibly gasp in the shop. I could not believe it. This one features just the 4 Sherlock Holmes novels, but not the countless short stories, which makes sense as it would be absolutely enormous otherwise. But I'm very much looking forward to reading them all, and I love having them all in one lovely looking book. The more eagle-eyed viewers amongst you may have noticed that these 2 books were actually sat behind me for the bulk of the episode today on that little black table there, and I think they're going to be a permanent addition. I think they look really good. So like I say, of course, always remember that indie bookshops are the best. But if you're a collector or love to display these eye-catching versions on your bookshelf, TK Maxx could be worth checking out for a once-in-a-while alternative. A big thank you for keeping me company today. I hope you found this episode suitably spooky as well as entertaining. In the show notes or description box, I'll be including shout outs to all of the sources I used during my research, along with links so that you can click through and do some further reading or check out some of the images or articles I mentioned. I'll also be listing all of our social media pages and our email address too. Please do leave us a comment if you're listening on Spotify, or get in touch on Instagram, Threads, Facebook, or even TikTok, and let me know your take on today's story. If you have a spare moment, a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts is always hugely appreciated. It really is a great free way to support the show. And if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you once again for joining me today, and I'll be back very soon with a brand new strange but true story to tell you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.